started in about a minute. We want to be respectful of your time. All right. It is 3:34, and so I do want to go ahead and get started. And so just a short and fun welcome activity. If in the chat, if you're able to, right? I know some of you might be driving, so if it's safe and you're able to, if you can please in the chat share your name, your role, what grade levels you serve, and then it's the holidays. On a scale of Buddy the Elf, how are you feeling today? Um, Let me see. I think I'm at a number 9. We just got a new puppy. And as I'm sitting here, I hear him going wild in my living room. I hope he's okay. The house has been puppy proof, but still always always just thinking, I hope he's not getting into any shenanigans. But if you can please share in the chat. Feeling tired. Well, thank you so much for being here, Lisa. Is anyone on break yet? Or do some of you still have this week left? Ooh, 2-week road trip. Cool, Ivy. 3 more days, I know. As a teacher, I always had a countdown for my next break. Yeah. So is anyone on break yet? Looks like not yet. Excited. Yay. Thank you so much for being here, David. Same here, Lucia. Our break starts this Friday and I can't wait. I already have all kind of plans, but I think I'm being a little too ambitious. All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing. We're going to go ahead and move on. And so Denise already shared the attendance link in the chat. If you haven't done so already, it's super helpful for us if you fill out your attendance form. Remember, as part of being a member cohort, we are documenting the sessions that you attend, right? Just to make sure that we're meeting all of the stated requirements for our grant. And so if you can and if you're able to now, please go ahead and fill out the CPE attendance form. If you're not able to do that again because you're on the road or just can't access it now, it's okay to fill it out later when you can. And then just a reminder that we do have our participant folder where all of our resources that we share with you throughout the sessions are shared here. And so I encourage you, invite you to bookmark the participant folder, right? That way it'll be easy to locate. And should you want to revisit any of the resources we share with you, they'll be easily accessible. We also always upload a copy of the slide deck, right? And so if that's helpful to you, you can always access it here in the participant folder. Just also a reminder, right? We also do record our sessions and they are available through our CPE website. And so if you haven't visited that, our recordings are available there, and then just a couple of other things, access to the link to our participant folder, I think is there. And registration links for our next sessions. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and move on, and I'm going to invite Denise. Denise, if you're okay with sharing the CPE coaching survey. Thank you so much.
Yeah, sure. So we got one more link for you in the chat box here. This is a survey just to kind of begin getting some information on your availability for our upcoming coaching sessions. It's been a little bit since we've talked about the coaching surveys, I know Natalie mentioned it at the beginning of this grant work. And so we will be holding three coaching sessions. Each session is going to be 2 hours long. And so the months that we are going to be holding these sessions are going to be in January, March, and May. And so what we've done is we've selected 2 days in each month for you to select from. So for instance, if you want to open up that survey, Natalie, I can give a little snippet of how you can select which day best fits for your schedule. And so if you could just fill in your name, phone number to reach you. And so as you can see there, for January, there are two dates. We try to do a Tuesday and a Thursday for each of those 3 months. And then we wanted to keep it easy and keep the same time as the PD sessions from 3:30 to 5:30. Again, the coaching sessions will be held virtually, but unfortunately, since it is coaching, it's not going to be available as an asynchronous option. And so it is required through the grant that you attend live in person on the day you have selected for each of these months. And again, it's only January, March, and May that you would have to select a day. There's also a box there if there's any scheduling conflicts or any additional questions or concerns that might come as you fill out this survey. You can go ahead and note it in that very last section. And we can send you email, calendar, or text reminders, whatever you prefer, because I know sometimes I know for myself, those are really helpful. And I think that was it. Did I miss anything, Natalie?
No, I think you captured it all. Again,
Yeah.
just a reminder, if there's any other questions, if for some reason any of the dates there absolutely don't work, right? Just reach out to us. We'll do our best to accommodate your needs. And so we're always an email away. And so we'll be sending out an email as a reminder to complete the coaching survey. And so if you can get to it now, that's great. But if you can't, that's okay. We'll send out an email with a reminder for you all to complete the survey. All right. And so now we are going to continue. I'm super excited for today's session, our introduction to geometry. And that's we're going to be talking about from infancy, from birth, right, to 8 years. And so just again, a big thank you for being here and welcome, right, into the world of geometry. Just a quick note throughout the session, we'll be using the abbreviations TK, of course, to refer to transitional kinder, and then K for kindergarten. All right, and so let's go ahead and continue. Also, a very quick reminder, right, that today's session and all of the resources shown here today are made possible through the Count, Play, Explore Professional Learning. Through their team, right, and through the Count, Play, Explore initiative, which is an early math and science initiative led by the Fresno County Superintendent of Schools and the Early Care and Education Program. The initiative is generously funded by the California Department of Ed and the California State Board of Education. And so thank you to our partners, right? They also collaborate with West Ed, who provides support in the development, right, of our resources and some data gathering. All right. So what we have planned for today's session, we're going to start by ourselves exploring and playing with shapes. And so we have what's a fun activity. I thought it was fun, right? When we practice it, hopefully you'll enjoy it also. And then we're going to go into describing the 5 key components of learning about shapes. And then we'll review, right, the ways that children develop knowledge and skills in geometry. But before we get into all that, if you attended our first session, there was a huge focus on math mindsets, right? And how our own math mindsets matter, right? In our approach in teaching math, right? How we as educators feel about math affect how our students feel about math. And so if you recall in that first session, we wrote a reflection poem called Dear Math, right? Where we talked about our feelings of math and reflected on our past experiences with math and also identified some of the things we're looking forward to and maybe shifting some of those perspective we previously had about maths. And so now I'm going to invite you to just take a quick moment and think about geometry more specifically, right? And think about what feelings arise, what emotions, right, come to play when you think of geometry. And we will go into a breakout room if you want to unmute your mic and share, or if you want to type something in the chat, right? But I want us to take a moment to consider our geometry mindsets. And so if you could respond to one or any prompt, start thinking about when I think about geometry, you feel, or maybe any memories you have. About geometry, right? I remember feeling or thinking, right? I was exposed to geometry and obviously in elementary, right? But my first memories of geometry that I was able to identify was my geometry class in high school. And so thinking of when right is the first memory of being exposed to geometry. Maybe you love geometry, so a favorite thing or something you love about geometry or something you find challenging. And so if you can please just share in the chat, or if you want to unmute your mic, um, and take a quick moment, right, to think and reflect about your mindset about geometry. So I'll give you all a couple seconds to gather your thoughts, and then feel free to begin sharing. All right. Give you all a couple more seconds, and when you feel called to, feel free to share.
I can share. This is Veronica.
Hi, Veronica. Thank you for being here.
Sorry, my late. I'm trying to complete a form online and it's taking me forever, so I lost track of time. But I'm here. Geometry for me, it's my boogeyman. For some reason, my brain shuts down. Um, and I avoid taking that geometry class. Um, I remember I postponed it until my last year in high school, and it was a nightmare for me. I didn't get it. I guess my brain is not wired that way. Who knows? I started to understand a little bit once I got to the university, and this professor like explained it to me in a different way. He pulled out this cube so I can see the faces and I can see the vertices and other stuff. Before that, it didn't make sense to me at all.
Yeah.
Why? I don't know.
Yeah. So thank you so much for sharing that reflection, Veronica. I also see in the chat, Denise shared, you enjoyed it more than algebra. I think so did I. So I loved my geometry teacher in high school. They made geometry super engaging. And so had a very different experience than I did with all my other math courses. And so very positive connections for me, in high school geometry class. Thank you for sharing in the chat, Lucia. I see you also remember high school geometry, no specifics, all of those formulas. Yes, I also remember having to memorize lots and lots of formulas. In preparing for this session, I was doing some reflecting also on those formulas that I remember. And I thought, wow, I don't know that I understood conceptually what they actually meant, right? And so just thinking, right? About the need for strengthening conceptual understanding, right, around geometry and really math and going beyond memorization of formulas. Aive, you feel excited. Yay. What I find challenging is doing all the calculations, yes, to figure out the sizes, lengths, etc. of geometric shapes. Thank you so much, all of you, for sharing your reflections. Oh, David, I also see you liked it better than algebra. So same here, right? The theorems, yes. Let me see. Also high school, right? So I'm noticing a pattern, right? We're all connecting geometry back to high school, right? Yeah, that's so interesting. And so we'll talk about today, right, what geometry looks like in the earlier grades. We'll share with you some activities that you can implement in your daily instruction, right, around geometry that hopefully, right, you feel will make geometry engaging and fun for your students. All right. Oh, Aida, that's an excellent question. I wonder if the reason many of us struggled in school is because we had teachers who also struggled to understand it and teach it, right? So talking about our math mindsets, that's a question that responds to it, right? Which highlights the importance of us and our own math mindsets, right? And how those influence the math experiences of our own students. Excellent, excellent question. All right. Let's go here. Here. So just a quick overview. And so before we get into exactly how children or the progressions, right, that they experience in learning about geometry or shapes, we want to begin by having a shared understanding of geometry learning for young children. And so geometry defined, right, it is the math of shapes, sizes, angles, points, lines, and dimensions. And for young children especially, geometry learning usually begins with exploring those two-dimensional shapes. And then, right, moving on towards the three-dimensional shapes. I remember as a teacher in kindergarten, our very last unit was three-dimensional shapes. And I always found it challenging as a teacher. To teach it, right? Because I felt my children, my students found it challenging. And so again, it just keeps taking me back to maybe reflecting on my current math mindset and teaching three-dimensional shapes. But we all know what those two-dimensional shapes are, right? Circles, squares, triangles, and then the three-dimensional shapes, spheres, and all of that entails just different things we'll talk about, right? Naming the shapes, being able to identify and name their attributes and their correct characteristics, finding similarities and differences between the shapes. But as children get older, right, their geometric thinking expands beyond that. And then this is when we see that children start to focus more on ideas like angles and lines and how shapes relate to one another in space. And so throughout today's session, I just want to know you'll hear us use the word shape a lot, right? Know that we're really talking about geometry more broadly. And then we'll use those terms interchangeably as we explore how geometric thinking shows up in experiences, right, for our students should be playful, meaningful, and connected to the real world. All right. And so how does geometry show up in our everyday lives, right? Well, geometry is really everywhere, and it plays a key role in the lives of children and us as adults, right? And that's why it's so important for us to help children develop their geometry understanding and their skills. And as you can see in some of the images there, we use geometry every single day, right? We use it when we're wrapping a gift. So if anyone here, right, if you celebrate Christmas and you've done some gift wrapping, you're using geometry there, right? Because as you wrap the gift, you're considering its shape, right? You're also thinking about the dimensions of whatever it is you're wrapping. You're thinking about the wrapping paper and what size of wrapping paper, right, you will need to cover that gift. When you're playing sports, right? When we throw a ball or swing a bat, we need to consider lines and angles, right? And then also when you cook. So even in something as cooking, I never before connected geometry to cooking, right? But when you're creating a dish such as homemade tortillas, right? What shape are tortillas in? We need to consider symmetry and size, right? And this matters, right? Because the way we roll and shape the dough will affect the way that it's cooked. And then we also see geometry, of course, in many professions, right? Those of us who are in the work of designing spaces, and I say those of us, like if I'm in the work of designing spaces, but those who are in the work of designing spaces, architects, right? Engineers, designers, they all use geometry concepts like length, angles, area, and shapes. Carpenters, right? They use geometry to identify and cut angles out of wood so that the pieces fit together correctly. Also, medical professionals, right? They use geometric imaging. And so, like in an MRI, they'll use geometry to analyze scans or even make diagnosis. For children, they also, right, use geometry in their everyday lives and routines. And so when children are creating or engaging in art, for example, they'll use shapes, of course, as part of their creations. For example, I can think of children will typically begin their drawings, right, by using stick figures to draw, and they'll use a circle to draw the head, right? And they'll use an arm, I'm sorry, a line to draw an arm and to draw the legs. Um, and then children might also begin to notice and describe shapes in their neighborhood or that they see, right? Just through their everyday experiences. And they can do this in English, of course, or using their home language or a combination of both, right? And so children can engage in translanguaging when describing shapes that they see just throughout their daily experiences, right? And so what you might see for a child who speaks two or more languages, right, is that they might say, right, they notice a círculo in their house, right? But they might use the word círculo in school, or they might use the word circle. And so just being aware, right, of students' home languages and how that might come into play or manifests itself when they're talking about shapes. And so, in highlighting, right, for our students specifically, that shapes are everywhere, I think it's super powerful to highlight that shapes exist in their everyday surroundings by showing them how shapes are present in their everyday surroundings, right? And so, by finding something that they can see, they are familiar with. And so, this is an elementary school where I used to work at, right? And so, I used to love using our own school as an example of where we can identify shapes. And so all I did for this activity was I took a Google image map and then had a conversation with students, right, about where we saw shapes in the front of our school. And then part of an extension activity that we did when we were learning shapes when I taught kindergarten, right? And this was very easy during distance learning because kiddos became experts at using technology, right? But with an app called Seesaw, I had them take just a picture in their home of their home or something in their neighborhood, right? And through the app, they were able to identify shapes that they saw in their image. And so this really pushes students to think about shapes and how they exist, right? And show up in their everyday lives and going beyond just what they see in their textbooks, right? So very important so that they see why studying shapes is relevant. And then just on here as I was preparing for the session, right, I also was looking where does geometry play an important role in other professions, right? And I saw this interesting article from Mathnasium, and they talked about math in the fashion industry, right? And how designers use geometry as they're designing clothes and as they're designing patterns for their clothes. Um, in us, right, of thinking of adults and how we use geometry in everyday life, I thought of when we go to Costco and loading our Costco cart, right? And so we're using geometry then, and you're thinking about multiple different aspects of math when we're doing that, right? We're thinking about weight. We're thinking about putting heavier objects at the bottom, but we're also thinking about shapes, right? We're thinking about angles, orientation, and space. And so as you're looking at your items that you're putting in your grocery cart, right, or your Costco cart, you're thinking, well, how do these shapes fit together, right? Can I rotate this box to make it fit better? Can I angle this item so that it fills up the empty space? And from the image you're looking at, right? They probably could have done a better job at organizing their cart. This would be something like what my cart would look like because I'm not always great at this. But there is, right, geometric thinking in things that we do in our everyday life, right? And just wanted to highlight, right, how geometry might show up for us as adults. But in something as easy, as mundane as loading a grocery cart, right? There's lots of spatial reasoning going on here. There's geometric thinking. And so in logistical terms, this might be a packing problem, right? But at its core, it's geometric thinking. All right. And so before starting our playtime, right? Because remember, it's important that we as adults also experience play with geometry today, right? Specifically, but overall with math. And so today we're going to be playing with a tangram, and we'll need a couple of materials for that. And so I'll give you a couple minutes to gather those. But before we start, I want us to think of a time, right, when you took something apart and then had to put it back together. And so, very open-ended. Don't feel like this has to be limited to anything geometry related or math related. Just in your everyday life, right? I want you to reflect and think about when was the last time you took something apart and then had to put it back together. And then once you've identified that, I want you to think, what did you learn in the process? And so in the process of taking something apart and putting it back together, what did you learn in the process? And so I'll give you just a quick few minutes to reflect on that. And then I invite you to unmute your mics again or share in the chat. Oh, yes, patience. So my daughter I have a 10-year-old daughter who loves Legos, and recently her Lego shelf collapsed and a couple of her Lego pieces just came apart, right? And so, you know, as an educator, mom was like, Ale, this is a great opportunity for you to take them completely apart and try to put them back together. I don't know if she agreed with me that it was a great opportunity, but yes, Legos have taught my daughter a lot of patience. Maria, I had to place a tent back to the box and I couldn't. Oh, I had to spread all the parts and figure it out. It was a challenge. The roller tape dispenser, not the usual one. Learned that I need to pay closer attention to how the tape is wrapped around the pegs. Those tape dispensers can be tricky. I agree, patience and observations are important, right? IKEA furniture, yes. I also have a nephew who's very much into Legos, and now he's older now, but he's like the family's designated person who puts together IKEA furniture. And so we call on him whenever we purchase anything on IKEA, and it works the same way that he was great at building Legos. He's great at putting together IKEA furniture. Ah, the copy machine. Yes. Yes. And so interesting, right? That you all highlighted patience, right? Observation. Yes. Oh, some strategies for taking things apart and putting it back together, right? You would lay out the pieces in order so you can work backwards. Good strategy, Lucia. Good, good. All right. And so now we are going to take something apart and try our best to put it back together. And for that, we are going to need a piece of paper. And so just your standard 8.5 by 11 piece of paper. And so if you have one around or close to your desk, and then we will also need scissors. And so I'll give you just a couple minutes to gather those. Um, And so again, just a regular 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper. And if you can find some scissors, and we'll give you a couple minutes to find some scissors. Those of us already starting to wrap gifts. I feel it's like the first thing we lose, the scissors, but hopefully you can find those easily from where you're at. And then once you've gathered those, we'll begin with our activity for today. So take your time, no rush, right? We'll give you a couple minutes to gather that. In retrospect, right? I should have let you all know that we were going to be needing scissors before this session, but once you do have scissors on hand, if you can just put in the chat that you're ready or give me a thumbs up, and then that way I know that we can move on with our activity. Thank you so much, David, Aide, Veronica. Thank you, Maria. All right. Lucia, ready? All right, cool. It looks like all of us are ready. And so now you're going to see, we're going to watch a video of Dr. Paul Rayner, and he is from Fresno Pacific University, and he's going to walk us through our activity. And so have your paper and your scissors ready and follow along. I'm going to follow along also, and we'll do this together. If at any moment you have any questions or need me to pause, just feel free to unmute your mic and then say, Natalie, hold up, right? I'm catching up. I need a moment. It's okay. We can pause the video. All right. Everyone ready? Okay. And then Denise, if you can you everyone see that okay?
Process, strategies, and looking at directions. Sure. Problem solving, how to read instructions in the rain, hand-eye coordination, tools, measuring and cutting with a ruler. This is a simple way to fold this edge.
All right. So you may or may not have a ruler on hand. You don't need it, but what you're going to take is take your 8.5 by 11 paper, and you're going to create the fold as you see Dr. Rayner is doing.
Over to here and make that square. Then we're going to cut off this piece here on that line. And we'll put that aside. We don't need this piece. It could be a bookmark for later. But then we're going to open this piece back up so that we start with the square.
All right, I'll pause it for a few seconds. And so if you're here, that's great, but I know I kind of skipped over a couple seconds when he was explaining that you can fold that right corner over, right? And that will help you make a square. Yay, I see some squares. And Denise is showing us, thank you, Denise. And so then you would cut off that extra part, and that should leave you with a square with a fold across and two big triangles. Yay, thank you, Veronica. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and press play. It looks like we're all caught up.
So once you have your square, you might hold it up in your camera. Let's take a look at your square. Does everybody have a square piece of paper or a square piece of chipboard? Yeah, excellent. Excellent, excellent. So you know this is a square because there's 4 sides, but each of those sides is the same length. And this has what we're going to talk about today as right angles. So when you look at this, here we have a right angle. We have another right angle, another one here, and another. We have 4 right angles. Each of those angles is 90 degrees measurement, and it's a right angle, and there are 4 sides that are all congruent, or also meaning the same length. As we continue through, we're going to make a series of folds and cuts, and I'll be using some language. I encourage you to sort of think about the kinds of words and language that you might be thinking about or using in your mind as you're building as well. So the first thing we're going to do is that kind of that crease there we have already. If you don't have that, you'll make that with your square. We're going to go ahead and return that fold and just make sure that crease is really well made here across. You notice now we have a triangle. A triangle, or in Spanish, triángulo, is 3 sides and 3 corners, or 3 points. It's a very pointy shape. What we're going to do is open that back up, and we are going to cut along that folded line. When you're done, you should have 2 large triangles. Each of these triangles has 3 sides. You can see those 3 sides and those 3 corners. As we get more precise in our language, we use the word vertex, or in plural is vertices. Vertices are corners. And we can tell that these 2 triangles are exactly the same shape and size by overlapping them. Look at that. Now we see 1. So they are exactly the same shape and size. 2 triangles, 2 large triangles. Each of these triangles has a right angle. If you see, this is that first angle we saw in the square. It's a right angle. Another kind of an interesting thing about this triangle is that this leg and this leg are the same length. They're the same length. So this triangle has a very special name. It's called a right isosceles triangle. Isosceles means it has 2 sides here that are congruent. 2 triangles. Okay, we're going to take one of those triangles and focus on that one first. And we're going to make a fold. We're going to fold this corner over to meet this corner. So we're going to fold it all the way over like this. And then we're going to have a crease down the middle. And look at what we formed. Yet another triangle. And if we look closely, this looks to be also like a right isosceles triangle. Here's a right angle, an angle that looks like an L. And we have 2 more corners here. We have these 2 sides that look to be the same length as well. Let's open this triangle. Let's open up our triangle again. And we see there is a crease right here. Look at that. Very interesting. It's almost like that line sort of creates a mirror image for this triangle shape, doesn't it? Let's cut on that line. And this is what we have now. 2 triangles, 2 right isosceles triangles. You can keep your microphone off, but I encourage you to say that aloud with me. 2 right isosceles triangles. How do we know these 2 triangles are the same shape and size? I wonder what we could do to see. That's the same. That's the same. That's the same. Ooh, Grace suggests that we lay them on top of each other. Let's try that. Well, what do you know? Look at that. Exactly the same shape and size. Let's set those aside. We're going to come back to those in a little bit. We're going to now take our other large triangle. For this large triangle, we're going to orient it like this, with the long side at the bottom and the two shorter sides pointing up. It's still a triangle if I turn it this way. It's still a triangle with this way. It's still a triangle no matter which way I turn it. Is it ever upside down or right side up? Just kind of depends on your perspective. We're going to start with it in this orientation, and we're going to fold the top point down to sort of the right there in the middle of this long side. And then you'll see you have a crease right there, and you're going to want to cut on that crease right there. So you folded that part down, back up, and then you cut that top off. Julia asked if they fold it in half first, and I think you were kind of thinking about this to find the midpoint and just sort of, you can do that, absolutely, if you want. You could kind of press it right there and find that midpoint, and that would give you a nice location to match up with that there. Absolutely, that will give you a bit more of a precise fold. Great point. Kathy, you're jumping ahead. Maybe we're making a tangram, maybe not. I'm joking. I like the predictions in the chat. That's lovely. All right, so now we have a triangle on the top, and we have an interesting shape down here. I wonder what we might call this shape. Well, let's look at what it has. First of all, it looks kind of like a mountain. As we start to think about shapes, we might start by talking about what they look like and what they remind us of. A more precise mathematical word for this shape is a trapezoid. A trapezoid has four sides. Let's count the sides. 1, 2, 3, 4. Exactly two of those sides are parallel. In other words, they look like railroad tracks, two lines that do not ever intersect. And that would be these top and bottom. They look like railroad tracks. The other two lines are not parallel. They will intersect. If we continue these two lines going, they will meet and touch. So these are not parallel. So this is a trapezoid. We have another triangle here. I wonder if we know the name of this. Oh, this looks again like a right isosceles triangle. Is it the same shape as the other ones or same size as these? Well, it is the same shape, but it's not the same size. Let's move that one over here. Now we're going to take this trapezoid and we're going to fold it in half this way. When we do that, I'm going to crease that up the middle. We open that back up. Oh, look at that. Again, we have a line there that seems to be sort of a mirror, a line of symmetry. Each side folds exactly onto the other side perfectly. Look at that. Let's cut right up the middle on that line. And now we have two shoes. Two shoes or two trapezoids. These are also trapezoids. They don't look the same as the other trapezoid, but they do have four sides and they have one set of parallel lines. These two are not parallel because if we continue them in an imaginary way with our fingers, we see they will hit. We're going to take one of these. I also like to call these shoes because you can kind of make them dance in kind of a shoe way, which is fun. You're going to take one of your shoes, one of your trapezoids, and we are going to fold the pointy edge, which is an acute angle because it is less than 90 degrees. We're going to fold that over to meet this corner of the shape at the bottom, right there. And then we'll make a crease there. Oh, and before you unfold it, look at what you have. You might see some different shapes. What shapes do you see? You might see a square.
Yeah, yes.
And within that square, do you see something? Sean sees two triangles. So take a look at that. Two triangles inside a square. That's really interesting. We might even say that each triangle is half or one half of the square. Let's open that back up and we're going to cut on that creased line. Now we have a square and we have another right isosceles triangle. A right angle, two congruent sides. Let's put these pieces over here. And we have one piece left. This trapezoid we will fold slightly in a slightly different way. Take your bottom right angle right here. When I say bottom, just so the way it's oriented like this. This is going to fold up to meet this obtuse angle. Obtuse is more than 180 degrees. I'm sorry, more than 90-degree angle. You can see it's open very wide here on the inside. We're going to fold it up like this. This is sort of a tricky fold, but you're going to fold it up so that it meets right there. And then that will be a crease like that. So again, this bottom corner folds up to here. And it creases. Before you open up this, what do you notice? What shapes do you see?
Triangles. A rhombus.
Interesting ideas here. Well, first of all, you see something that has four sides. Then you see on the inside two triangles. I wonder if these triangles are right isosceles triangles. You see four sides again, and the interesting thing is the top and the bottom lines are parallel. They'll keep going on forever. This side and this side are parallel. They will keep going on forever. It has four sides with two sets or two pairs of parallel lines. Thus, it is a parallelogram. Now, it could be a special kind of a parallelogram. A special parallelogram is one that might have all sides the same length. Does this have all the sides the same length? That's a good question. If we take one of our other small triangles, we can kind of use that to help measure. We can look at this side. That's the same length. Let's put it on top. Oh, that side's a little bit longer. If they were all the same, we could call it a rhombus, but they aren't. So we'll have to call it a parallelogram. This side is longer than this side. Good thinking. Now we're going to open this up. And we're going to cut that right along that crease. What do you notice? What shapes do you see? We see another one of these triangles. We see another one of these triangles. And we see a parallelogram. We see a parallelogram. Some of you were thinking this might be a special parallelogram called a rhombus, where all four sides are the same length. But we discovered this side is a little longer. These two sides are a little longer. So it's not classified as a rhombus, but yet a parallelogram. Well, now let's take a look at our pieces. Let's take some inventory. What do we have? First of all, how many pieces do you have? Let's take some inventory. You have two large triangles. Check. You should have one medium triangle. You should have two small triangles and a square and a parallelogram. Or we could say two quadrilaterals. Quad meaning four sides. Two quadrilaterals. They each have a special name because of some things about them, but they're also both called quadrilaterals. Do you remember what we started with? We started with a square. Can you put your pieces back together to make the square?
All right. And so now, right, if you have all your 7 pieces, we are going to give you some time to put the square back together. And so who you just saw now is Dr. Paul Raymer from the Ames Center, right? And the Ames Center is, they collaborate with CPE. They're a nonprofit organization. They are based out of Fresno, right? And their center supports just playful, hands-on, and creative approaches to STEAM teaching and learning. And so they offer PD. This was a PD that I participated in, right? They have learning partnerships with other organizations, and they're also very involved with community engagement. And so Dr. Paul Raymer is the executive director of the AIM Center. And so I thought it made sense to show you the video of him directing you through the activity because he has the camera right. But if you would want to replicate this activity with your students or with teachers you support, there is in the slide deck a step-by-step guide in creating the tangram puzzle. And so that's available for you there. your inventory, right? A total of 7 pieces. And so that's available for there, right? If you want to share with other teachers your support, with colleagues, or if you want to prep the activity for students. But now I'm gonna give you a couple of minutes. We'll do 5 minutes and we'll play some Christmas songs as you work to put your puzzle back together. And so we'll give you some time to try to do that. I'll check back with you all in about 5 minutes and see where we're at.
This is hard.
going to pause the music there. That's about 5 minutes. A quick check-in. How's everybody doing? Was anyone able to put it back together yet? Are we still working? How's everyone doing? Not yet.
No, look,
No luck yet.
75%.
Anyone else? You know what I was thinking? I think it was Lucia earlier who said in the chat, I kind of map it out and go backwards. I was like, if you remember the steps in which we cut the pieces, that might be helpful in putting it back together. Um, Trying it but can't do it, not able to do it. Oh, Lisa, you're gonna hand it off to your colleague. Yes, in preparing for our sessions, right? We also they had us engage in a lot of puzzles. The tangram was one of them. It was also super challenging for me. But we did some super cool ones called the Soma Cube puzzle. And so similar purpose, right? But with 3D shapes. And so just sitting with my table, I was always the last one to be able to successfully solve the puzzles. And so it's totally okay. Can't remake good challenge for those kids who like challenges. Yes. Oh, spatial stuff. Yes. So this is a tangram puzzle. And so let me see. I don't remember if I put the I don't think let me go back. Ah, no, I didn't put the answer here. I didn't put the slide deck, but I took a picture of it with my phone just in case I needed it. But we could go ahead and upload that and show you the solution. But if you're gonna keep on working on it, don't take a look at it yet. But we'll go ahead and put that up before the end of the day. But this is a tangram puzzle, super fun, super engaging way, not for adults and children, right, to engage with shapes, exploring shapes, right? Turning them on their sides. That's a very common misconception with our youngest learners. And so I really liked how Dr. Reamer emphasized, right? If I move it, if I rotate it, is it still a triangle? And I see Veronica, you're nodding your head, right? I taught kinder. It always kind of surprised me, right? How I would say, is this still a triangle? And it was frequent and common for students to say, no, it's no longer a triangle, right? And so that's perfectly developmentally appropriate, right? That's because they're looking at the way something looks and not focusing on the attributes quite yet, right? But with support, our students will get there. And so just some other activities, right, that you can extend when working on the tangram puzzle is you can ask students, right, to do things like find two small congruent triangles. And so that way you're having them engage with hands-on activities and you're using that content specific vocabulary, right? And you're also asking them to think, what can they make with those two pieces? And so when thinking of if students, right, can find the two small congruent triangles, someone said spatial reasoning, right? They're developing their spatial reasoning. They're learning how shapes fit together, how parts can make a whole, right? And how objects change when we turn or flip them. And at the same time, right, we understand that language development best happens when students are engaged in a meaningful hands-on process, right? Because words like congruent, sides, right, or corners or vertices, and thinking of our older students when that math vocabulary gets more specific, is just there's a stronger connection students make, right, when they're engaging at the same time with something that they can see and touch. And so activities like this, right, they support problem solving, flexible thinking, perseverance, that patience we talked about earlier, right? And so when engaging in these activities, right, I want to highlight that oftentimes there isn't one single correct answer. And so it's totally okay for students not to solve the puzzle, right? The point is, or the importance of this activity is the process, right? And that they're engaging in maybe revisiting their ideas and adjusting and trying again, right? And so just this kind of hands-on, right, activities really lay the foundation for later math learning, right, including things like fractions, area, and even algebraic thinking, right? And then you can also ask your students, for example, to make a boat with their shapes, right? So you can ask them to create figures with their shape. Now, a lot of them are super creative and they'll start making figures on their own and they'll show you that, right? And you can celebrate that. But when you ask students, for example, to make a boat, we're doing something super intentional, right? We're inviting them to start seeing shapes not as isolated figures, right, or something that's confined to the boundaries of the classroom, but really start seeing shapes and how they show up in the world around them. And so children, right, we want them to start beginning to recognize geometry in everyday items like boats or houses, right? And this just helps for them make geometry and math overall really feel meaningful and real. And so again, while they're manipulating the shapes or moving them from place to place or flipping them or rotating them, right, to represent an idea in this example, a boat, it's helping build their spatial reasoning and their flexibility in thinking, right? And so no single correct way to build a boat, right? And that's super powerful. We want to be explicit with students and tell them that it's okay if their boat looks different than what their neighbor built, right? The point is engaging in children again in meaningful play with shapes, right? In helping them and supporting their decisions, and they can explain their thinking and then maybe even revise their creations. And so again, the goal isn't that they're able to create a boat, right? The importance of this activity is the process. When asking students to create shapes, right, their activities can also be differentiated. And so, was anyone able to solve the tangram puzzle in the room in the 5 minutes? Well, maybe we would all benefit from some differentiation, right? And so there are ways that you can differentiate the puzzles. And so if you see the shape on the left-hand side, that one has the outlined shapes, right? And so this just provides more visual support. And this can help children focus on matching the shapes, right? They'll still notice size and orientation, but you're helping build also their confidence, right? As they engage in these activities. Now, the other puzzle, like the one you see on the right-hand side, there are no lines, right? And so you can't exactly distinguish what shape makes the airplane, right? And so that removes that layer of scaffolding, and it really invites students, right, for deeper spatial reasoning. And so students were super quick at solving these, right? You can provide a challenge by providing the different levels of tangram puzzles. And so again, children are just visualizing how the pieces fit together, right? They're planning and readjusting their moves, they're problem solving, and it's super open in a super open-ended way. I do want to share with you that these are available for, let me see, what tab did I leave it on? Not here, but they are available for you to print. And so they are in your participant folder. And so you can print these out. And so just different tangram puzzles, the differentiated ones. And so you have these three up here, right? Some more options. The ones that are blank, some teachers like to color code them. And so I know if you have like just a bin with shapes, right? And you can color code those, and maybe that's another layer of scaffolding. And then here are the ones at the bottom without that the outline of the shape. And so these are available for you in your participant folder for you to take a look at. All right. Um, and then of course, right, you can also with especially with older students, you can begin to ask students, right, what relationships they see between the tangram pieces. And so here we're being intentional about shifting their attention to the shape attributes, right? And so we're focusing on them noticing those sides, those corners or angles, right, size, and how shapes are either the same or different. And so a type of question like what relationships do you see between the tangram pieces, right, really encourages students to begin to compare, classify, and describe, which are all core geometric thinking skills. Right. And so students are engaging and practicing that very content-specific vocabulary. And again, because the question is open-ended, right, and lends itself to exploration, all students can access this material, right? And there isn't going to be one correct response because what one student may notice, right, might be different than what another student may notice. And so we as educators are listening for their observations, right, and for their reasoning. All right. And so hopefully you all enjoyed the activity. If you weren't able to solve it, I encourage you during your free time to go back and revisit, right? And try to solve it. Now you can absolutely do the tangram puzzle with your students, right? And there's ways to adjust it depending on your grade level. But we also wanted to share with you today a couple more activities that you can take directly back to your classroom. And so the activity you see here is called the shape viewfinder, right? And in this activity, educators can create a shape viewfinder, and that's basically minimal prep, right? It's a shape cutout, and you put it into a specific shape, and you have children explore and find shapes in their environment, right? And so the image that you see there, it's just a popsicle stick with a construction paper shape glued on there, right? You could take a walk around your classroom, you could take around your school, and you have students identify shapes that they notice. Now, the goal for this activity, right, and especially thinking of our younger learners, is not for students only to correctly name the shape, right? The intention is that they start to notice and visualize shapes in the real world. And so as students look through the viewfinder, and that viewfinder can look like what you just saw there, or you can create the super cool one, right, that you can do with like sheet protectors or Ziploc bags, that as they look through those, right, they'll also start noticing those shape attributes. And so they can talk about sides, corners, curves, right? And you can help them and guide them in comparing, right, what is the same, what is different. And so this activity, I think, is super accessible, right? Again, highlighting that our students don't need perfect academic language to engage in this activity, right? They'll be able to point, rotate the viewfinder, they can use their gestures, and definitely invite them to explain their thinking in their own words, right? Which is especially important for our multilingual learners and students who are in the process, right, of developing that academic language. And so again, for this activity, no right or wrong answer, right? The point is that we act as facilitators of knowledge and just encourage our students to find different shapes, right, using their viewfinder. What matters and the focus here is how they explain their reasoning and their thinking. And for this activity here, you also have a resource that we've uploaded on your participant folder, and this isn't it, it's right here. And so you have just an overview, right, of the key concepts for this lesson, activity instructions, how to create the shape viewfinder, and then connections, right, to the math standards and learning foundations. And so here's the instruction for the viewfinder with the plastic bag. Again, you could use a Ziploc bag, a sheet protector, and then you can also write the name of the shape that students are finding. And so instructions are here. Again, super engaging way for students to begin exploring, right, how shapes are present in their everyday surroundings. Now for older students, right? Let me go back to the slides there. We have this activity called stretchy shapes. And so in this activity, you can group children in small groups, right? And so lots of collaborative learning. And in this one, they're using a stretchy band, or you can also use yarn to create two-dimensional shapes. And this one's super cool because they're having to use their bodies and their hands. And so for this activity, right, because it is recommended for older students, the goal is to help students understand, again, bigger focus on shape attributes. And so they'll start noticing things like sides and vertices and how shapes can change while still keeping those same features, right? And so you can ask students just to manipulate, right, the yarn and forming different shapes. And so students, for example, can begin by making a triangle, but then stretching it larger, right, or smaller. And then as they do this, they'll notice what changes and what stays the same, right? And again, this will help them understand that shapes can look different, but still be the same shape. And then you can take it a step forward and you can ask students to engage in making predictions in what will happen if, for example, you add a side or add a corner. And as they make their predictions, right, they'll have to test those, and they'll test their predictions by physically adding to the shape and observing what new shape has been created. And so also available for you in your participant folder is the guide for that activity. And so again, low prep activity, right? That you can take directly back into your classroom, highlights the key concepts, the materials you'll need, and activity instructions. And then again, as with any strategy, right, it's always adaptable to what you feel might work for your students. We all serve in different contexts, in different classrooms, have different students, right? And so feel free to adjust it with whatever you think will work best for your group of specific students. Yay, Lucia, you did it. That's so good. And it feels good, right? When you solve it, you're like, yes. Congratulations. Yeah. All right, and so these resources also available for you in that participant folder, or just an overview, right, of the activity I just shared with the stretchy shapes activity. And again, the main purposes of this activity is that students learn, right, shapes and a focus on their attributes. They'll use their knowledge about shapes and their attributes to make a variety of shapes, and you'll guide them through that, right? And they'll think about, right, the shapes and their attributes. So just some of the goals for activities. And then again, as with any other activity, right, you're asking guiding questions that'll extend their thinking. And so you're asking them, what stayed the same? What did you notice change, right? What do you think will happen if we add one more side? And so again, just a super low prep activity, right, that can get students more engaged with hands-on activities and thinking about geometry. And then I also want to take a quick moment, right, to connect these activities to the California Common Core Geometry Standards from PK/TK through third grade. And what I did is upload grade-specific standards to your participant folder, specifically for geometry, right? And so in your participant folder, you'll find another folder with the Math PTK Learning Foundations and the California Common Core State Standards for geometry only. And so you can click on first grade and then you'll see your first grade geometry standards there, second grade geometry standards there. And so in PKTK, right, brief overview, students are expected to recognize the name shapes and they'll describe shapes. And it's totally okay, again, that they use informal language, but they should start noticing, right, again, shapes in the environment. And then in grades 1 and 2, the standards shift toward reasoning more about attributes, composing and decomposing shapes. And so they're understanding, right, that shapes can look different, but still be the same shape. And so just by having a better understanding, right, of the attributes that make that shape. And then finally, by third grade, students are explicitly asked to partition, compose, and analyze shapes and explain their reasoning. And then the activities that you just saw, the shape viewfinder and the stretchy shape activity, right, are directly aligned to this progression. All right, and so those are available for you in your participant folder. And then also available for you in your participant folder is this resource, right? The California P through third math learning progressions. And so this just puts it all together really nicely, right? And it highlights the progression between and how through preschool and TK math foundations, right, connect to the California Common Core standards. And so it just illustrates how children's math understanding, right, develops over time. And math development, right? Again, highlighting that should be playful, it should be inquiry based, right? Students should be afforded opportunities to explore and always developmentally appropriate. And so this resource, I uploaded the whole document on there just because I think it's valuable for our sessions here, right? And so the table you see there is specifically for geometry, but the whole preschool through third grade learning progressions for mathematics is available. I mean, it's an you can easily Google it, right? But just for the things of keeping things together, I also thought it might be helpful to have it in your participant folder. And so if you'd want to access it, it's also available for you there. All right, and so now let's discuss exactly how it is young children learn about shapes, right? And so younger children will begin understanding shapes by perceiving their similarities and differences. And so you'll see a ton of activities out there for young children, right, where they're having to sort and fit the shape into a bucket, just how you see in the image. And so perceiving similarities and differences just describes, right, the ability of young children to notice what things are the same, what's different in object attributes. That includes things like size, so they'll notice size, right, color, texture even. Um, and there are different ways that children can do this. They can do it by actually touching and manipulating the objects, right? By bringing those objects to the mouth, by mouthing, or even just visually by looking at the objects. And so when our younger children first start to notice similarities and differences between shapes, right? They'll see and feel that the shapes are different. However, they don't quite yet understand how exactly or why they're similar or different, right? And so they know that they're different. They can't exactly understand why or how it is that they're different. And so children don't develop this deeper understanding of what makes a shape similar or different, right? Until they get older and begin to classify shapes and learn about shapes attributes, right? And so the next stage, right, is that children will extend their learning about shapes and they'll begin classifying them. And so this means that students will begin to group certain shapes together based on those similarities that they notice, right? So first comes the noticing of similarities and differences, and then comes the classifying. And so once children notice how objects are the same or different, they'll just naturally begin to group similar objects into categories. Now, these categories can vary, right, depending on the age of students, but in their very first years, right, infants can classify shapes organized by different attributes. And not only shapes, right, but a skill of classifying objects, right, is a skill developed in infancy. And so they'll begin to, for example, I don't know, they'll be able to identify that this group of objects is all furniture or this group of objects are all animals, right? And so that skill is carried on into shapes, and they'll be able to identify that this is a group of all circles and this is a group of all squares. As children are exposed to more and more objects, right, they'll classify objects more precisely. And so for shapes, they'll group similar shapes together more accurately. Like, for example, all of these different types of triangles are triangles, right? And they'll also know when something belongs to a different shape category. For example, a trapezoid is different than a square. And so their classifying, right, gets more complex and more specific as they get older. All right. And so when classifying shapes, right, you'll notice that sometimes for our younger learners, right, variations in shapes can be a little challenging, but they'll still engage in this activity. But when they're classifying these shapes, they'll focus on very general features, and so they like all of these are round or these are pointy, right? They'll refer to the triangles as pointy, but very typically, right? Children, when they observe the differently sized triangles, I'm sorry, circles, it'll be easy for them to recognize that they're all circles, that they're all rounds, and that even though they're a different size, they all belong in the same category. Now, what's a little more challenging is when we imagine children observing the three triangles on the right-hand side, right? This is a little more difficult for them to identify these shapes as part of the same shape group because all three shapes have different sides and angles, right? And so you'll notice how they're slightly different and they're oriented in different ways, right? And so sometimes a point is on the bottom or a point is on the top. And so very frequent to see kiddos, right? When you rotate the shape or when you stretch it out for them to think that it's a different shape. Younger children can classify shapes that don't vary much, right? Like circles or squares. Typically classifying shapes like the triangles you see there doesn't happen until they're older, right? And so more challenging with the variation in triangles. All right. Now, let me see here. All right. And so again, in continuing and thinking of how students classify shapes, right? You'll notice that the classification of shapes can get a lot more complex, right? And so I wanted to highlight that children's exposure to different types of shapes directly impacts their ability to classify shapes. And so the more children are exposed to shapes, right, the better they are at being able to classify them. And so this brings me back to that shape finder activity, right? And this is helpful with that. And so it's important that we as adults and as educators draw attention to shapes in children's environments or activities, right? That are both typical and atypical shapes. Now, usually what happens is that in our books, in our curriculum, in the stories we tell, or just the shapes we highlight, they're almost always typical shapes, right? And so like the shapes you see on that column there under the typical shape category. And so most children's books, their toys even, or learning materials will primarily show these typical versions of the shapes. Now, atypical shapes, on the other hand, are much less likely to be highlighted by educators, right, or in other learning activities like children's books or in curriculum. And so examples of atypical shapes, yeah, they include a square, maybe with the point at the top, right, or a long and skinny triangle, or a triangle with the point facing down. Now, we call these shapes atypical because they're not commonly shown in children's books, their toys, or their learning activities, right? And because children are more familiar with typical shapes, it's easier for them to be able to classify the typical shapes. And so younger children, right, are able to notice the differences between shapes, whether they're typical or atypical. And that's important because they might notice, right, that one shape is long or skinny and that the other one has a point at the bottom. However, because children's exposure to atypical shapes might be limited, they might not yet classify them accurately into the correct shape category. And so, for instance, children may not initially recognize that the atypical triangles on this slide, for example, belong to the same shape category as a typical triangle. And so this is where we as adults play a super important role because we want to be mindful of intentionally highlighting both typical and atypical shapes, right? And through this, we support children in learning to accurately classify all shape types. All right. Now, around the same time that children learn to classify shapes, they also learn to identify them by their name, right? And this can be in English or their home language or both, right? And so whatever multiple languages our students have, they'll begin to name these shapes, right? And they typically, of course, begin to learn two-dimensional shapes names before they move on to three-dimensional shape names. Now, I do want to highlight that identifying a shape and naming a shape they're related, but they are two different skills, right? And so identifying a shape is the ability to recognize the name of a shape, for example, by pointing to the correct shape. When you ask, where's a triangle? The student can identify it, they can point to it. Whereas naming a shape is the ability to label a shape using vocabulary, right? And the naming can be spoken, written, or signed. And so the component of naming shapes is described here. It can take different forms based on the children's preferences, right, and their abilities. And so some children might demonstrate their knowledge of shapes by using the actual vocabulary, while other children may choose to demonstrate their understanding through gestures, right? And all developmentally appropriate for children to engage in that behavior. All right. Now, additionally, some shapes can be described as being part of a group of similar shapes, right? And so if you observe the quadrilaterals on this slide, a quadrilateral is a shape that has four sides, and Dr. Raymer highlighted that through the tangram activity. They have four sides, right, or edges, and four corners or vertices. And so also, again, thinking about that more specific math vocabulary. But these shapes are all examples of quadrilaterals, and you may notice that these shapes not only have some things in common with each other, but they also have some differences. And so I do want to give us a minute or two to try out this collaborative activity. And so Denise will put the link in the slide. Now, in the activity, I want you with your group, and maybe we can just make two groups. Think about how the shapes are similar and different from one another. And just pick one shape. I think I prompted you in the directions to the collab site to do three shapes, but just pick one shape with your group and develop in your own words a definition for that shape that you chose, right? And so with your group, you're picking one of the shapes, and in your words, you're thinking of a definition. And so think of the attributes. Think of the sides, think of the corners or vertices, right? Just use what you know and come up with a definition of a shape in your own words. And like always, I talked too much and we're running late on time. And so we'll just do one shape and then we'll give you about 3 minutes and we'll come back to share with the whole group. All right. For making your way back, I was gonna say, oh, the slide is up there with what your answers could potentially look like, right? But the point of that collaborative activity, right, and also something you can do with your students is to get you to think just more deeply about the shape attributes, right? To think about the lines, the edges, the vertices. And so I'm going to invite you all in the chat if you want to share maybe what shape you chose, what shape your group chose, and then the definition you came up with. Were you able to come up with a definition? Let me go see it. Let me go take a peek at your slides. Yay, I see some here. So I see this group chose a rectangle definition for sides for angles. Oh, 90 degrees. You got specific there. Two sides are longer, congruent and parallel. Two sides are shorter, congruent and parallel. Yay, all right. Oh, and the environment, that was a good addition. You could see it in a door or in boxes. Yay, thank you so much. Thank you for participating in that activity. All right. Was the other
Well,
group
it
able?
can be tailored to according to the age group that you're teaching. You know, because if I teach my preschoolers, oh yeah, this is congruent, they're gonna say, yeah, whatever, right? But at least we got to introduce them to those kinds of words, and eventually, oh, I heard it before, right? So that's why we mentioned the fact that naming objects that are in the environment
Yes, for
makes
sure.
more
Thank you
sense.
so much for highlighting that, Veronica. Oh, thank you, Lisa, for putting it in the chat. Yes. And so again, right, an activity like this where you're having students before you provide the definition, right? If they're already familiar, it depends on your learning cycle, right? But if they're already familiar with some of the shape attributes, you can get them to start just exploring and thinking more specifically about those attributes and asking them to come up with their own definition of a shape. And so on there, I know that, for example, on the video that we saw where we're working on the Tangram puzzle that Dr. Raymer was leading us through, right? There was a comment about one of the shapes being a rhombus. And so I'm still also learning, right? And so he clarified, right, that a rhombus, the opposite sides are parallel, the sides are equal in length. And so two sets of parallel sides and equal in length. And so something I learned, right? Okay, so now I want us to talk about the most common 3D shapes, right? That are just our learning cycles, our curriculum will typically expose our students to. And so for 3D shapes, right, students will learn to identify or name these shapes, and that includes a sphere, a cube, right, a cone, a cylinder, and a pyramid. And so these five are the typical ones that we'll see in their learning activities. And so for this, I really want to highlight how important it is, right, that we as adults use precise vocabulary when we're naming these shapes, because it does affect how children identify or name them themselves. And so as adults, we can often use informal names to describe these three-dimensional shapes, right? And children will often do the same. They'll do what we model, right? And so, for example, adults will typically say ball instead of sphere. And so just being mindful of the vocabulary words that we use when describing three-dimensional shapes, right? Or you'll also hear cubes being referred to as boxes. Now, this depends on context, right? Like if you're on the soccer field, you're not going to say a sphere. It's very appropriate to call it a ball then. But when we're during instruction, right, it's super important that we refer to them by the precise vocabulary word. And so adults and children also often use names of two-dimensional shapes to refer to three-dimensional shapes. And so you'll also see, for example, that adults and children might say triangle when we really mean a pyramid. And so again, just thinking of vocabulary development, it's important we encourage children to learn the three-dimensional shapes, their names right, and we'll need to be consistent about using this vocabulary when engaging with our students. And so far, we've discussed a total of three components about learning about shapes, right? And the first one was perceiving similarities and differences, right? And so happens in infancy. And then kiddos move on to classifying shapes. And then now, right, we've just talked about naming shapes. I just want to give you an opportunity to chat. Anything super new for anyone? Any takeaways so far? Yet feel free to drop it in the chat. I'm gonna move on, but as you think of it, was there anything new, right, in thinking about the progression of how children learn about shapes? You go ahead and just drop it in the chat. Now, I want to talk about shape attributes, right? And so when older children start classifying shapes, they start paying closer attention to shapes attributes. And so some shape attributes, right, they're properties of a shape, like the number of sides or corners. Now, two-dimensional shapes have two types of attributes. They have edges, and that's the side of the shape, or vertices, and those are the points where the two edges meet. Now, edges and vertices are defining attributes of a two-dimensional shape, right? And the number and types of edges and vertices determines what shape it is. And so, for example, a triangle has three edges and three vertices. Now, three-dimensional shapes have a total of three attributes, right? And so they have edges and vertices, just like two-dimensional shapes, but they also have faces. And so faces are the flat surfaces on the three-dimensional shape. And so edges, faces, and vertices are the three defining attributes of three-dimensional shapes, right? And then the number of edges or faces or vertices will determine what shape it is. And so, for example, a cube has 12 edges, 6 faces, and 8 vertices. And again, just highlighting, right, that the language we use as adults for these attributes affects children's vocabulary. Now, throughout our presentation, I've been calling it lines, edges, vertices, points, right? But when we're during instruction, we should be using precise vocabulary to describe these attributes. Now, as children become more familiar with shapes, they'll begin to explore in composing and decomposing shapes, right? And so children will often do this while building structures or even while drawing something, right? Or making art with shapes. And so at first, children will focus on composing and decomposing individual shapes. And so, for example, a child might put two triangles together and they'll notice that it makes a square, right? Or they'll cut a square piece of Play-Doh into two triangles. Eventually, children will make more complex pictures and designs. For example, they might create, I don't know, an apartment building, right? And so if you're learning about buildings, they might create an apartment building using a long rectangular tile or draw a long rectangle, right? And they'll draw circular tiles for windows. And so children do engage, right, in the exploration of composing and decomposing shapes, and this helps them understand that shapes can be divided into smaller parts. Now, knowing that shapes can be divided into smaller parts is a foundation for something that comes later, right? And that's understanding geometric area and fractions. And so, for example, in early elementary school, children will learn to divide a circle into 4 equal parts, right? And they'll learn to describe these 4 equal parts using vocabulary like halves, thirds, or quarters, right? And so really laying the foundation for that in the later grades. And then we are almost ready to end for today. So thank you so much. But before ending, I wanted to bring to your attention, right, connections to literacy and language. And CPE also does an amazing resource at recommending books that we can connect with the topics that we cover, right? And so available for you also on your participant folder is this book, right? The Quest for Tangram Dragon. And so if you're thinking of, if those of you that like the Tangram activity, there's also a literacy connection, and there's a book guide for you, right? Available on that participant folder. And so it gives you questions you can ask, right, throughout the book, and it gives you just other resources to connect literacy and geometry. And so just another resource available for you there, thanks to CPE. All right. And so far, right, just a brief overview of children's knowledge of shapes. And so we've discussed the 5 components of shape learning in early childhood, right? And so the slide, it's just a recap, right? It shows you what children in where they are, right, in development, what they know about shapes using the 5 components, which are the perceiving similarities and differences, right? The ability to classify shapes, then comes the naming, and then learning attributes of shapes, and then composing and decomposing shapes. So just a nice graph that really summarizes all our learning that we've done today, right? And the skills that students should be engaging in depending on where they're at in their age or in their grade. All right. Well, that brings us to the end of our presentation.